I want them to live in the country that is not the same country, a better one than even the one I grew up in, which is the greatest country still known to mankind and human history, if you ask me. Few things I want to say is we have 3 branches of government again, not 4. The administrative state's gone. We're not dependent on our enemy for our modern way of life. That's communist China. Our economy is again growing once again at the fastest pace in the developed world, as it has for most of our history. It can be again. And that we are once again proud, most of us certainly proud, to be citizens of this nation. That much I know I can deliver. And in order for me to think about the most effective path to get there, between now and January 2033, that's my real destination, not November 2024. I have to go in order of effectiveness. First, what can the president do without lawmaking, using existing legal authority? Next, how do you go through Congress to pass the laws under the Constitution as it exists? And then third, look at what amendments we might want to make to the Constitution itself. And the legislative method of doing it doesn't open up the can of worms that you talked about, but you're right. Term limits would require, which I do favor, term limits would require an amendment to the Constitution. I favor hard citizenship requirements, like passing that same civics test that an immigrant has to pass, or else, at the very least, serving this country in some capacity for 6 months. That would require a constitutional amendment. So we're not going first with that. You got to go in the right order. That comes later in the presidency. Now, I do want to say one thing about term limits, because it does get talked about a lot. I'm in favor of it. I think other candidates are too, and it's important. But it goes back to the first point I made to you. The real fact is that the people we might even be term limiting today aren't even the ones who are relevant, right? They're just puppets. And they enjoy being puppets, right? Showing up on cable television at night and then going home and get a attaboy on your back from your wife and your kids or your people in your community and whatever. That's a fine job for the people who select that, but they're just frontmen, right, for the real agenda. And so what I actually favor and can implement without amending the Constitution, without even requiring a law from Congress, is term limits for the bureaucrats, right? The people who are running the show. That's where we need fresh lifeblood. So what I've said is I, as the leader of the executive branch, if I'm elected, if I, as the leader of the executive branch, cannot work for the taxpayer and collect a paycheck for more than 8 years, which I think is a good thing, then neither should any of those federal bureaucrats reporting into me either. Forget the civil service protections. It's an 8-year norm for most positions. Are there going to be some exceptions? Fine. But the norm, our HR policy, the norm, is that it's 8 years. No more than 8 consecutive years working in that position. That is how you suck the lifeblood out of the deep state. Send people back to find honest work in the private sector. How you create a culture of service for people who actually serve in that role too. Now, I think we only need 25% of the employees that we actually have there. So that's a lot smaller number of roles to fill anyway. People say, how will you fill all those roles? Well, here's the answer. We're only going to have a quarter of those roles left in the first place. But that is how you drive generational change. So what's the legal authority? Well, there's a little used U.S. statute, 5 U.S.C. 3302. It gives the U.S. president sole authority to set the regulations governing the Office of Personnel Management, the HR department. So again, in corporate America today, and it's funny how these parallels exist in the private sector, you might think if you're an employee working at a giant corporation that the CEO has no say and it's the head of HR that actually determines what your hiring policies are. But the way it's really supposed to work and the way it works on the books is that the head of HR still reports into the CEO. Well, our executive branch actually works the same way if you read the law, right? OPM still reports in to the U.S. president. Yes, OPM has its own regulations, the Office of Personnel Management, but 5 U.S.C. 3302 gives the U.S. president sole authority to set those regulations. And so, Shawn, I think that's why it takes a unique combination. It takes an outsider, somebody who has been a CEO, who has not grown up within the government, but also someone who has a constitutional scholar level understanding of the U.S. Constitution and the laws of this country. And those two things don't usually go together, right? One type tends to be academic. They don't get things done. The other type, and I put in a complementary fashion, a guy like Trump in this category versus professional politicians, break glass, get things done, but may not have a native understanding of the laws and the Constitution first. Personally, I have to rely on advisors. We have a moment where you cannot depend on relying on the advisor class, because the advisor class will tell me no for the same reasons they told Trump no. Here's one difference, though, and I give Trump a lot of credit for this, is that the current Supreme Court, which he constituted and gave us, agrees 6-3 with my understanding of everything I've just told you. So will we get sued? You're darn right we will. But that actually takes it to the Supreme Court, which then codifies everything that we're talking about here into judicial precedent.
Okay.
Which means the next president who comes after me won't have his hands tied in the same ways that my hands were tied, and even more so, the ways that Trump's hands were tied. That is how we drive change on the time scale of history.
So you have a real plan here. That's the best plan I've heard. Actually, everybody else just says they're going to do it.
Yeah.
But I've not heard a real plan by anybody. So
that's why I'm grateful for forums like this rather than a 3-minute hit on cable television, because in that, or a 30-second ad on television that you pay for and plant across the country, because in that forum, yeah, it's a two-dimensional TV screen, and that's all we have. And the truth is, there's only two things that allow an outsider like me to make this possible right now. If this was a traditional media landscape where everybody in the country voted in the primary on the same day, forget about it. I wouldn't even bother. There's no chance an outsider like me can come in. It's about who has the most super PAC money that can put up ads in 30-second and 60-second formats on television to raise name ID. And then, by the way, networks reward the people who buy ads from them. And that's exactly how the ball game would be played. But the two things that are different is Iowa, New Hampshire, these states go first. I've been there more than any other candidate. People in those states are able to meet you, get a three-dimensional feel of who's real and who's not by being in the room. But the other big change is, frankly, people like you doing what you are, right? This is direct to voter, direct to viewer conversations of a form that you don't have in traditional linear cable media. And those two things are what make it possible, and I believe likely, that we'll succeed in not only winning the nomination and the presidency, but hopefully succeed in leading the national revival of those 1776 principles that we have long forgotten.
Well, I'd like to commend you for doing it. I was going to wait till the end to do that, but I've had another candidate on. He was supposed to fly up here, turned into a 15-minute Zoom call, which was just a bunch of sound bites. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take somebody like you that's going to get out amongst the people and not do the traditional 5-minute news hit, scripted answers. And it shows you're not too good to be amongst the people. And I really appreciate that. And I think a lot of people really appreciate that.
Thank you, man. One thing I'm trying to do in this process is I'll just lift the curtain, how the sausage is made. You don't know a funny reason Kamala Harris was in a similar situation too, is a lot of times when candidates don't want to come in person and do a sit down, and it's the same political consultants, right? They're like the equivalent of the permanent deep state, but in the campaign world, mm-hmm. right? I mean, it's the candidates come and go, but those guys are here for good. The little trick they play is, I'm not making this up, is when someone's doing an interview virtually, they're doing it usually facing a camera where there's a teleprompter in front of them, and they have people who are putting up the themes to hit as their talkers, as they call them, talking points, mm-hmm. to be able to actually flash them such that it looks like they're looking at you on the screen. They're literally looking at words that remind them. And so it's just a tactic, again, in modern politics where everything you can to hide from the truth, that's the way the game is designed to be played. And my view is that if you're not willing to sit across the table from a podcaster, NBC News, a 22-year-old on a college campus, you're probably unfit to sit across the table from Xi Jinping. And so I'm trying to practice what we preach. But I'm grateful for folks like you as well, because the traditional media landscape has not done this country any great service in the last 10 years.